patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 37 of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman Talosky, as always, and I want to thank you so much for tuning in to this podcast. I hope you enjoy it. Couple of quick announcements for you before we get started for today's solo episode. First is that I'm very, very thankful for all those who have submitted questions for the upcoming Q&A episodes, which will be coming out on May 17th, 2021. So 2 weeks from this episode's date, we will have our third Q&A. I've got a lot of great questions. If you didn't get a chance to submit a question, don't worry about it. We will have more opportunities later on this year and in subsequent years. Secondly, Dan Freeborn of the Freeborn and Liberty podcast had me on for his episode 11 on April 27th, 2021, so that was about 6 days from today's episode, and we had a really wonderful conversation, and I am so grateful to have had the opportunity to get onto the show, talk about Friends and Fellow Citizens, but also some other subjects about free speech on college campuses, and the importance of this issue. This is obviously an issue that we're still continuing to discuss, and something that is going to have to get a lot more momentum as we try to figure out ways to protect more free speech, not restrict it. So make sure to check into that. I've got that on the press tab of our website, shermantalosky.com. So please check that out. I really appreciate Dan for having me on this show. It's a great show. Make sure you subscribe to Freeborn and Liberty. Lots of great content, lots of great guests on Dan's show. And now let's get into today's episode. So a little bit of context for you today. Here, and this show is based in Washington, D.C., and there's a number of landmarks, a number of places that we all think about. We think about the Lincoln Memorial, the U.S. Capitol, the White House, perhaps the Supreme Court building, Library of Congress. But there's one small park that I frequent a lot, and certainly this is something that some tours might also get a chance to walk around a bit, because it's between the Capitol Hill, between the U.S. Capitol and the Supreme Court, all those buildings, and Eastern Market, which is a very, very popular destination, obviously, as the name suggests, for farmers market, all kinds of restaurants and shops and so forth. And almost every single day when I walk in that kind of area at this time, and even in years before, there's a square called Seward Square. Now, when people walk through it, it doesn't seem like a very prominent little park area. It's actually, there's kind of a transversal, Pennsylvania Avenue runs diagonally through one direction. There is, I believe, North Carolina Avenue that runs the other direction. And I just wanted to reflect a little bit about some of these names. I'm always curious about what these squares or these places are named after. And Seward Square is named after William Seward, who was a former Secretary of State for the Lincoln administration, all the way back in the 1860s, and also served in the Johnson administration as well. And this just got me thinking about William Seward. So I did some research about this man, a man who it doesn't get a lot of name recognition, clearly. But the more I read about William Seward, the more I am impressed with the things that he was able to get done. And I truly believe that he was not only a very skilled and shrewd politician and lawmaker, but a great patriot as well. And I just want to acknowledge that. Not a perfect man by any means, but certainly in many ways a man ahead of his time. So a little bit about Seward. So Seward is from New York. He grew up in, I believe it was a small town in New York. He practiced law in a place called Auburn, New York. Very, very, very skilled guy. Obviously was very much interested in the law, but he really wanted to be very upfront on issues that were essentially very, very new at the time. One of those issues was on immigration. When Seward became governor of New York, he didn't have the easiest time. He wanted to really push this idea that immigration for America was good. There has to be obviously some consideration as to how you're able to balance between nativists, the people who are already in the states, and those coming in. But you really want to advocate for that conversation and to have policies that could really give America a very diverse population, a population not just of people of different ethnicities, but of different skills and different backgrounds and different cultural backgrounds too, that would add to the fabric of the nation. He faced a lot of opposition, and it was a very, very difficult time because even as he was a Whig, the Whigs were known for their anti-slavery stance, among other stances, but he still faced opposition from a number of people in different parties. But Seward pressed on, and he went quite far. I would say, even as just the governor of a state, we went very, very far as to try to get the conversation going, and also to pass policies that would bring more immigrants to New York, and especially in New York City. New York City was very different at the time, and there was a certain huge Protestant bent when it comes to the running of public schools, and there were people arguing that because of kind of the religious background and whatnot of the United States and so forth, that immigrants weren't welcomed, and he really pushed against that. I think that was really admirable, especially given how tough New York politics is, especially how difficult it is to navigate through all that opposition. And Seward pressed on with also his abolitionist stance. He was a staunch abolitionist, and not one who was particularly popular, clearly. As many of you might know, within the anti-slavery movement, there were a number of factions. One particular faction was called the Radical Republicans, and these people, as probably the name suggests, were the folks who were basically, I think, already not just abolition of slavery, giving equal rights to all, finding ways to get African Americans to back into society as equal with equal people with equal rights. Seward, I believe, did tend along towards that, but I do think here's the difference here, and this is something that is a bit of a lesson to all of us, which is it's one thing to have a passion and a staunch stance for something, like Seward did. He was a staunch abolitionist, but he also knew that he couldn't burn bridges. And this is really, really important. Seward was able to work with people on all sides of the aisle. People within his party, even those who were more nativist, those who were perhaps a bit more moderate on the slavery issue. He obviously got along well with people who agree with him on this issue of abolitionism. But he also maintained relations with Southerners, especially with Southern members of Congress. Seward was a senator from New York. He was elected in 1849 to 1861, and he obviously truly believed in this idea of deliberation, that despite big differences, you had to stand your ground, but you also had to make sure you didn't burn bridges, because he truly also believed that the Union was central. I find it very extraordinary, because when you have someone like Seward, who did everything he could to push to advocate for abolitionism, he was part of a number of schemes, number of ideas to expand an idea of abolition. He got a lot of popularity in the North, but we also realized that it politically cost him. Even though he was governor of New York, faced all those obstacles, and he was a senator for New York, he ran for the Republican nomination in 1860. And I have no doubt in my mind that if it wasn't for his staunch stance, on anti-slavery sentiment, Lincoln would have what obviously be the clear winner, and he was. Had Seward been more moderate, we probably could have seen, instead of a President Lincoln, a President William Seward. That was how popular he was. But it certainly did cost him votes. The nativists in his party, in his wing, were very, very, very skeptical of Seward. And they sided more with the Lincoln folks and some others who preferred a more moderate approach. But here's the thing. Seward knew that he probably wasn't going to have a path to the presidency. But he still believed in the Union. He still believed in the national unity. And that's why he decided to campaign for Lincoln. I can't tell you how many people in his group of supporters who probably really very vehemently disagreed with him. They probably thought that Lincoln was going to be a sellout, and probably feared that Seward was going in that direction. But he did. He campaigned for Lincoln. He knew that Stephen Douglas, who was the Democrat, a Democrat nominee, the other one was John Breckinridge, also a Democrat. But he knew that Douglas, an Illinois guy, was going to get a lot of support in Illinois. But he truly believed he wanted to make sure that Douglas didn't win those states. He wanted to make sure that Lincoln was able to get that election victory and not have it be sent to the House, which would have been a bloodfest anyway. And that's what happened. Lincoln was elected, albeit with less than 40% of the popular vote. But I truly believe that without Seward, so campaigning, without his conviction to keep the United States together, we might be seeing something very, very different. Now, moving on to really what happened after the secession of the southern states. As you know, with South Carolina, and then after a bunch of other states seceded from the Union, Seward truly felt like this was the inflection point in the United States. And as Secretary of State, his job became even more challenging. In recent years, in Congress and the White House, and really in the national debate, a lot of people have been talking about foreign interference, and we've spoken about foreign interference before and about the Washington administration. Seward was wholeheartedly dedicated to stopping foreign interference in the Civil War, especially stopping any foreign help for the Confederacy. And there were two countries that were incredibly critical: the United Kingdom and France. This was especially difficult because he knew that there were so many monetary interests that the British could have had. In fact, the British government was considering recognizing the Confederacy. Imagine how big of a blow that was when one major country recognizes the Confederacy as a legitimate country. It would have been a huge catastrophe. Not just the diplomatic side of things, but imagine how big of a hit in morale that would have hit the Union. France was also a big concern as well. Now, for the UK, Seward was very successful with all these negotiations, all of the work that he and his team put together. They were able to not only stop the British from recognizing Confederacy, he also managed to work with the British to ensure that new ships would not be supplied to the Confederacy. Worked with the British government to be able to detect any ships that were helping, slave owners or helping the South in any way, and able to stop them. This was a really, really big success and a huge, huge deal. And finally, the British government officially recognized that they would not recognize the Confederacy. Big victory number one for Mr. Seward. But the other challenge was France. France, under the pretext of protecting their own nationals because of a dispute with Mexico, which clearly was not the case, wanted to intervene in Mexico. And there were a number of other countries involved. Spain was involved. I believe the UK was involved to some degree in terms of protecting their nationals from a very, very contentious Mexico. Mexico had, to say that it had a rough history, especially with all the different administrations, all the presidents that were coming in and out, is an understatement. How crazy was that place? And France basically tried to intervene, tried to put someone in there, Maximilian I, into power in Mexico. And I believe the plan for France, if it had been for Seward, was to put in a guy who is very pro-France, essentially let the French just come in and completely take over Mexico. It could have been done. Mexico was in such disarray. There was almost no opposition against the French. Seward recognized this, and he recognized that it wasn't just France infiltrating Mexico and posing another threat to the United States, but also was a threat to the Civil War cause. The Confederacy, as you could probably imagine, would want to exploit any opportunity for the Union to lose legitimacy, to lose any kind of control, any kind of diplomatic relations. And the Confederacy wanted to see that the Union would collapse. So Seward, with a very staunch stance, with his diplomatic power, along with obviously the support of the rest of Lincoln's cabinet, was able to, after years of negotiations, of talks, of red lines and so forth, finally the French pulled out of Mexico. But it was the crazy thing. Maximilian I actually eventually got executed. That's how crazy it was. But anyway, that's a whole other episode. Very, very contentious at that time. But again, going back to kind of my previous point, which was, even though this seemed like a very, very minor thing, with so much attention on the battles in the Civil War, but Seward almost single-handedly was able to stop two major powers from giving the Confederacy any kind of legitimacy or any kind of support. Really, really extraordinary successes. And it really defined who he was. Domestically, Seward was someone, again, that man who had all those relationships with even Confederate politicians, basically people who vowed to fight against the country, right? He still was able to engage in talks. There's something called the Hampton Roads Conference, which was an attempt for the Lincoln administration and Confederate officials to try to make an agreement, to make a peace agreement together. And while it did not come out basically out of any success, Seward put out a message that I think I really thought this was so reflective of his character. He sent a bottle of champagne or bucket of champagne to the Confederate envoy ship. And it's reported that he shouted from his ship saying, "Keep the champagne, but return the Negro." In other words, keep the champagne, but bring back the people who are part of this country who deserve equal rights, to be, as American citizens, should be treated equally, just like everybody else. Very, very simple message, but one that was very, very blunt. Something that I think, again, really defined who he was as a statesman. Now, it's true that in the Johnson administration, I would give more criticism against him, although in many ways, though, it was a very, very difficult situation. Andrew Johnson, who I think basically everyone knows is by far one of the worst presidents we've ever had, was involved in the impeachment trial. He was obviously impeached by the House for basically trying to kick out a guy named Edward Stanton, the Secretary of War, without basically doing it illegally. And it basically was a smear campaign. It would have been a much bigger smear campaign against Edward Stanton had he kept going. But Seward stuck to his guns. You know, he had a job. He had to remain Secretary of State. He had to do what he had to do to keep the country together, but also to do his job to maintain foreign relations. Because even when the United States is broiled in a domestic battle, like what we've seen with the Civil War, no question that Seward was thinking well ahead of his time. What does the United States look like beyond 1865, beyond the end of the Civil War? That's what I believe, what he was focused on. And to close, you know, looking back on the life of a man like William Seward, and he's not a man who everyone is going to recognize clearly. I mean, I use the example of how, you know, people walk through the square, but I don't think a lot of people maybe even know what the name is. But William Seward, I think, is an example of someone who was ahead of his time, but was not afraid to, again, make his stance, but also to be able to build relationships. Because I believe it's the relationships he had, not just with his friends, but with people who vehemently disagree with him. It's the relationships and his ability to foster peace, to bring some kind of civility, some kind of diplomacy within the political culture of the United States. That was his main stance. And one other success he had was the Alaska Purchase. You know, Russia obviously needed a lot of money. They were running out of money after the Crimean War. He went in. He understood both sides. He understood the particular interests, and he was able to negotiate with $7 million at that time for Alaska. There were critics who literally called this Alaska Purchase Seward's icebox, because they felt like, why is this guy buying a huge piece of land where there's basically no one living there? But he didn't care about that. He believed that Alaska geopolitically could be something not just of economic benefit to the United States, but perhaps something that could matter very, very, very much in the next several decades. Who knows, right? At that time. And it turns out, if you fast forward over 150 years, look at the economy of Alaska. It's dependent, and its energy resources, how much of a factor that is nowadays. So, to conclude, William Seward is someone who I found a lot of interest in, and I hope that you share that too. He was a man who was not always the most popular man. There's no question that his stances, people probably thought, come on, no way anyone's gonna think like him. Why is he risking all his political capital on something like abolitionism? That's what people thought at the time. Now, people probably told him, like, say, Mr. Seward, you're never gonna be president if you have these stances. But I don't think he cared. He was very, very articulate. He was very, very deliberate. One who cared about relationships, about keeping this country together more than anything. And I believe that's why he deserves a positive reputation. I hope that Mr. Seward will be maybe highlighted a bit more in the history textbooks. Someone who, again, was not perfect. He understandably had some criticism, especially during his time during the Johnson administration. The fact that he had to kind of defend the president since he was Secretary of State under President Johnson. But I wanted to share that with you today because this podcast is all about sharing about the people who maybe don't get as much attention, but maybe who should. Maybe just someone else who had some other characteristics that I could add to the mix of the countless people who have served in Washington, D.C. And I believe Mr. Secretary William Seward truly is a hero of mine, and I hope that you will look more into who he is as an individual, as a lawmaker, but as a patriot as well. And with that, thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe and share this podcast with your friends and family. I really, really appreciate all of your support. Again, make sure to check out this Q&A that will be coming out on May 17th, 2021. Have a great rest of your day, rest of your week, and I'll see you at the next episode.